Thank you very much. And last night I was speaking in the same room, or the same building anyhow, about obesity. So I go from one difficult problem to another. Let me start by making one or two comments about science, evidence and policy. Policy is a matter of trade-offs, complicated trade-offs, and it's not easy, and that's why we don't do it. We leave it to politicians. And so where in that set of trade-offs does evidence fit into the picture? Because most of politics and policy formation is not about evidence. Most of it is about the values of society, weighing up fiscal priorities, public opinion, political ideology, and so forth, sometimes diplomatic considerations. Evidence, and that's all about values. Evidence generally, at least scientific evidence, we try and create as value-free as we can. But policy made without evidence is largely based on belief and dogma, and by definition is less likely to be successful. And so what we are seeing is an increasing understanding that the role of scientific evidence is to provide the base information on which these other domains, those values-laden domains I've mentioned before, are placed by the community, the policymaker and the politician. But separating the values dimension from evidence is not always easy. And in an area like suicide, it's particularly difficult. The inferential gaps between what we know and what we think we know are often very large, and the multiple dimensions of the problem and the multiple stakeholders involved make it difficult to avoid a concatenation of values with evidence. And this is difficult, and in fact many of the complex issues that we face in this modern world have this concatenation. And my job is really to try and tease those bits apart and provide the data that the government needs. Everybody would like a simple problem, a simple solution, even to a complex problem. But when we come to the area where biology, society and mental health coincide, it's important to acknowledge that nothing is simple. When considering the tragedy of suicide, it is inevitable that many people will advocate from one perspective or another. Yes, it's a mental health problem. Yes, it's a sociological problem. And yes, it's a societal problem. All said and done, we all have the tendency to use the evidence in front of us to identify with a particular component of the challenge. The same applies to family members, many of whom will inevitably continue to think about a situation over and over again as part of dealing with their own emotions. Of course, this mix can be made even worse by the simplistic nature of much media reporting and occasionally even by coronial inquiries that can oversimplify a particular case. Very regrettably, such reporting often focuses on the prurient immediacy of a particular situation and does not deal with the complexities of society that may lead to the situation at hand. Suicide is the sad but convergent conclusion of a number of pathways, and we must be careful not to overgeneralise. For many, the situation is a result of the complexity of modern society that may exist at several levels, from the whole community to the domestic context. Such complexity is intertwined with levels of emotion that may or may not be recognised as a mental health disorder. However, for others, and particularly for young people, suicide can be the impulsive outcome of an acute situation that for a more mature mind, or one less disinhibited by drugs or alcohol, does not lead to such devastating outcomes. So as a non-expert on suicide, but as an ex-paediatrician whose own research focuses on evolutionary and developmental perspectives, let me make a few comments that may have some utility in considering what scope of evidence needs to be analysed in seeking solutions. It would appear that some societies and some parts of society have very high rates of suicide. In New Zealand, we worry a lot about youth and the higher rates of suicide in young Maori. It would appear that New Zealand youth as a whole tend to do relatively badly in the transition through adolescence compared to many developed countries. So let me focus on some of the contextual reasons for this situation, acknowledging that these are as much challenges for the research community as they are for society. The first thought I want to bring forward is about young people in frontier societies. There's a good body of evolutionary science relating to how social groups form and how they interact with each other. In general, societal groupings are formed by setting rules and supporting people to conform to such rules, and those who do not are expelled or confronted in some way. In this way, societal grouping became socially cohesive, and conflict within a group was able to be managed and suppressed. Conversely, between groups, conflict was the norm. Evolutionary analysis has extensively modelled how groups deal with cheats and freeloaders, that is, those who don't contribute to the group collective, and various forms of punishment and exclusion evolved to handle such individuals. Those rules, those basic rules of society which evolved over 100,000 years ago, only work as everybody is playing to the same set of rules, and ambiguity in rule setting was avoided. When people started to live in large groups from about 7,000 years ago, the principles of defining in and out groups emerged, but political and religious structures evolved to help delineate the social rules. In this way, societies evolved with very strong principles, and people grew up knowing their position, even in complex multi-class and hierarchical societies. Most European societies have the strong history of clear societal structure about the rules of social engagement. But in recent years, much more ambiguity has emerged, even in those societies, for a variety of reasons. However, frontier societies, such as New Zealand, have another characteristic. They're young, and from the start they involve, by definition, non-conformists or people expelled from other groups. And as a result, these societies generally comprise multiple groups of different histories and origin. As a result of this, no single culture or set of rules emerges easily. In such circumstances, rebellion is more likely, and people can respond to censure by simply moving group identity or by confusion. In the course of this happening, the ambiguity, or the level of ambiguity, has been enhanced by the changing positioning of the media and celebrity culture. What happens if the message around what is normal and what is acceptable, which was not necessarily very clear in the first place in a frontier society, is muddled further by the diet of antisocial behaviour, unrealistic expectations, ideation, and emotional fairy tales provided by the mass media and the social media. My second thought is around the effect caused by this massive change in human social structure. As the distinguished evolutionary biologist Robin Dunbar has pointed out, the human brain evolved to cope with group sizes of up to about 120 people, which until recently was the maximum size of communities in which we lived. Indeed, even when people moved into cities, until the development of the car and the telephone, people essentially lived and worked within these small aggravated villages joined to each other. But when that change started, but even while changes started about 100 years ago with telephones and motor cars, it has really been only in the last 20 years that things have changed radically with the development of the internet and social media. The way people now communicate and interact has fundamentally changed. The reality of our last 150 years of existence, based on a mixture of verbal and physical communication, has been replaced for many with electronic signals based on bits and bytes. Facebook networks of so-called friends have expanded for many young people well beyond 150 people. Within such a weird context, some people may be moving beyond their socially adaptive capacity, in the same way that others who develop diabetes are moving beyond their metabolic adaptive capacity. The results of this pressure arising from this need to adapt may be manifest in many ways, but particularly in the way our evolved emotions operate. And within this context, we have to ask, what is normal mental health? The burdens and pressures on people, and particularly the young, are now so very different. Emotions like anxiety and depression, which are normally protective in many situations, may now be more likely to put some people at risk. Contexts are hard to change, and we must work harder to understand much more about what will create emotional resilience in such situations. There's a third factor which is now much better understood. In the last decade, there's been an explosion of knowledge about the development of the adolescent brain. In short, it takes much longer than we previously thought for the brain to fully mature. Both structurally and functionally, the brain does not fully mature until the third decade of life. And the last functional components to mature are those associated with impulse control and judgment. Additionally, there is some evidence to suggest that it's a normative part of development that the risk-reward pathways and therefore perceptions of risk are exaggerated in their development early in adolescence. Thus, it is inevitable, healthy and normal that young people will engage in risk-taking behaviours. What is changing for a host of reasons is the nature of the risk-taking behaviour. Huckleberry Finn might have been happy rafting down the Mississippi, but many of today's adolescents see risk-taking in terms of what they see in enormous volumes on the web and television. The celebrity culture focuses on two particularly dangerous activities, drugs and alcohol, and the evidence is clear. Mix drugs and alcohol with normative risk-taking behaviour, and we see things like huffing deaths and more road accident peaks. Now add in what I've mentioned already around a higher rate of emotional disturbance in our type of frontier society, and the risk of suicide may be increased accordingly. In response, we need to think in terms of both mitigation and adaptation, words I've stolen from another complex area, climate change. Mitigation means asking how we make people more resilient to the inevitable changes in human ecology I've described, and secondly, adaptation, asking how do we manage people who are struggling for whatever reason in the context of the modern societal framework. Clearly, in this regard, detection of emotions that are becoming harmful and appropriate treatment is needed. And this leads to the fourth question: how can we preemptively create a culture change about drugs and alcohol? The last few years have shown us that this is very difficult. Literally, the genie's got out of the bottle. The fifth issue, which we should not ignore, is that about contagion, which results in clusters and copycat suicides. This is well recognised. These phenomena are well recognised in the academic community. The problem is we no longer know how common this is. Because of social media and television, a cluster need no longer be geographical and thus may not be identified. Suicide ideation may be infective, but that does not mean that the method of death needs to be consistent. As likely happened recently, it was indeed an accidental death that received much publicity that may have triggered a series of unhappy events. I've already mentioned celebrity. The boundary between premature death of celebrity caused by drugs and alcohol or by suicide is not always clear, and the media play this up in all sorts of ways. We have the problem of the modern media, no longer subject to the social norms that the traditional media followed. And so the challenge of media portrayal of suicide is growing. On one hand, the media proclaims it is doing good by publicising suicide. On the other hand, there are many in the academic community that remain certain that if done irresponsibly, this increases the risk of doing harm. Anyhow, who's to judge what is good publicity and what is bad? This is an almost impossible problem. The genie again is out of the bottle. While it may be too soon to draw a firm conclusion, we have to consider the possibility that the reported rise in suicide in the last 12 months relative to the previous year may relate to the changed behaviour of the media in recent years. Overall, the key question then is how to create greater resilience in our young people. Clearly, it would be easier if we could reconstruct our society, but that's not realistic. Rather, we have to deal with the more connected, more aggressively interconnected world, where there's now so much more ambiguity about boundaries and societal rules. So where could resilience come from? In part, it must be created by a society establishing clear boundaries, rules, and expectations within a multicultural environment. In the current environment, it's becoming harder to do so, as the traditional models of religion, tight schooling, youth groups and the like are being changed by the radical changes in family and social structures and a media that can no longer be constrained. And so sex, violence and drug use become normalised. Resilience for young people still remains largely a matter of family structure and boundary setting. However, what we have also learnt more recently is that resilience is also a lot about early life experience. There is no doubt that how executive function emerges is heavily influenced by the early years of life. The work of the Nobel laureate Heckman and others makes it clear that it's not the cognitive component of early childhood education that matters. Rather, what is important is the development of non-cognitive or social skills, learning about cooperation, task completion, and so forth. This is particularly so for children from vulnerable settings. It is clear that the quality of early childhood education experience in terms of non-cognitive skills impacts on those factors that makes a person resilient in later life, whether they will cope with adolescence, whether they'll complete school, whether they'll have a job, will have a stable relationship, whether they will be arrested or not, and so forth. In summary, I do not think that we should look at suicide in isolation, as tragic as every case is. Clearly, suicide has multiple causes, and so it is difficult to generalise. But perhaps we could do better if we see it as a signal of a set of challenges for the human condition in the face of rapidly changing social structures. And from this perspective, it's important that you engage in this meeting in a holistic discussion. Suicide is also an area where good research must be done to inform a set of complex policy decisions. But it's also a subject where both our ancient and recent history indicate that the range of realistic actions has to be based on thinking about the modern realities of this world and the complexities it creates. But I've suggested to you, but there may be some places to go. Better early childhood education for the most vulnerable families, an honest look at drug and alcohol use in our society, consideration of the impact of the very different kinds of communication techniques we now have, and the effects of the chaotic electronic environment we now live in. And of course, there's a need to become much better at identifying those people who are in some level of emotional distress and provide solutions for those people through culturally appropriate mental health services and other community support processes. Thank you very much.